Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we have a great episode in store for you. We're going to talk about shoulders simplified. I think shoulders are one of the most commonly injured areas in the gym. A lot of people carrying shoulder niggles or injuries, and we're going to try and distill quite a complicated part of anatomy down to some simple principles, which will hopefully help you get the most out of your shoulders and potentially address some of these simpler niggles or injuries. But before we get into it, as always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. We've just upgraded the movement mechanics mentorship program. So if you're a coach, PT, or healthcare professional wanting to get a next level understanding of movement and learn a detailed and structured assessment protocol to help your clients or athletes improve the way they move, then please check out the website to learn a bit more. Also, wit-fitness.com. For all your WIT kits, please use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And for all your blood flow restriction apparel, use discount code LL20 at Hytro to get 20% off. Right, let's get into it.
Yes, mate.
Shoulders.
I know. I mean, shoulders, we absolutely blast them. Like,
Yeah.
like whether you're a powerlifter, crossfitter, whatever, like athlete, like any throwing type of athlete, that shoulder goes through an absolute beating. And you understand why it does, because at the end of the day, a ball and socket joint with not much kind of hold, there's a fair bit obviously structurally holding it in, but the amount of forces and stress and positions we ask, you fully understand why injuries happen. Because I think prep work is such an underutilized thing, which I know we're going to kind of go into, and like, some of the movements that we kind of like that you and I now kind of are in, or especially now in my arsenal that have been in yours for a while. Like, it's amazing how much the shoulders last. I think I'm more impressed because I was talking to one of my clients the other day about it, and we was in the low bar, we was doing a low bar squat, and I was talking to him, and he didn't even consider about shoulder mobility and stuff like that, and how much of there's quite a requirement to put yourself into the low bar position for where the shoulder has to kind of roll into and stuff. And it's amazing because that what he goes, it's a leg exercise. I was like, yeah, but there's so much going on in the upper body and the shoulders. So what are your thoughts obviously on all this?
Yeah, I think shoulders are, on first glance, a very complicated piece of anatomy, and I think they are complicated. But that's not to say that there aren't some simple guidelines that you can implement to upgrade the way you look at them and the way you treat them. So I think the purpose of today is to do exactly that. Like, how can we simplify a complex joint to treat it how it wants to be treated and hopefully get a little bit more out of it from a training point of view? I think we need to have our disclaimer caveat that obviously this isn't diagnosing any shoulder issues you've got. That would require proper assessment, but I think there are some helpful takeaway tips that we're going to give for overarching principles for how to treat your shoulders. And like you touched on there, why is it one of the most commonly injured areas? The shoulder is a ball and socket joint, and it's extremely mobile. So the number or the range of positions that it can achieve is probably the most of any of the major joints of the body. You can go into nearly 360 degrees of positions through your shoulder, and in life and in sport, it quite often does. And probably the first thing I want to talk about is how is that reflected in our gym-based training? I think the positions and directions that we train our shoulders in is actually very limited compared to the number of positions that the shoulder potentially could achieve, which feeds into why it's so commonly injured. If all we do is push and pull horizontally and vertically, we're missing so many potential positions that the shoulder could get into. And I think that's the start of why shoulders can end up being dysfunctional or hurting and not performing as well as they could because they're just not getting stimulated in a great percentage of their possible position capacity, should we say.
Yeah, and I also think there's the case for shoulders then doing too much when they shouldn't be taking, the other muscles should be taking more of the load. So it's like, for instance, with a bench press, and there's people that are just fully protracted, which again, I'm all for protraction in a bench press and any type of chest press movement. But then they're trying to max out reps and they're pushing that bar into that position and then keeping, say, their shoulders internally rotated on that way down and just taking, the shoulders are taking all that load. And you're like, your chest is what's supposed to be, your chest and your lats are supposed to be loading that weight down. So it's like, if you're putting it all into the shoulders, is it really supposed to be taking 100 kilos in this position and then pushing out of it? So it's like, not only is it we're not utilizing them necessarily correctly, we're also then overusing them in times because we're weak in other areas, or other muscles just don't, you don't actually know how to perform the movement correctly. So that is
Yeah.
also a thought.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big part of it. And because the shoulders are near the top of the body, in anything standing, potentially anything downstream of the shoulders could be having an impact. So if you've got a bad foot, ankle, knee, hip, spine, your shoulder operates on top of all of those things. So if there's a big imbalance or dysfunction going on downstream, it's likely that that's going to be felt upstream. And I think that's something that doesn't often get considered. When someone's got a shoulder injury, we just obsess with the shoulder and think there must be something wrong with it intrinsically or the rotator cuff. But actually, a lot of shoulder function is dependent on all those body parts down below. So making sure that there aren't any big red flags happening just even like immediately below in the T spine, for example, should be step one for figuring out if there's something more complex going on with the shoulder.
So, what would you say is massive? Like, what would you say is wrong with most common training practices? We've already kind of lightly touched on it, as in kind of keeping things mainly just vertical pushing and pulling, horizontal pushing and pulling. But what other maybe areas shall we dive a little bit deeper into this that maybe we come across?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So, in terms of traditional gym-based exercises, like we touched on earlier, we've got a heavy focus on the sagittal plane, so forwards, back, up and down, pushing and pulling, and that's usually with the spine in a fixed position and a static lower body because we're trying to isolate out the upper body. But if we think about how our body has evolved, it's the shoulders would be swinging in gait. So, you naturally swing your arms combined with some movement through the spine and obviously some counter movement in the lower body. Or we've evolved from monkeys where we'd be swinging through the trees. So, the normal, natural, evolutionary use of our shoulders has been around arm swing combined with thoracic spine and lower body motion together. And if we think about other, like air quotes, natural movements like throwing, like if you're
Yeah.
throwing a spear and hunting and stabbing, all those sorts of, or fighting even, those movements are always full body movements. So we very, very rarely, or almost never, would use our shoulder in isolation. So I think a couple of things baked into that. One is that the shoulders move in three planes of motion, and so we need to get out of the sagittal plane, as we always say, giving them some stimulation in the other two planes of motion, get them going sideways, get them rotating, but also move them more in conjunction with the rest of the body. Like having a constantly fixed spine means that the shoulder, whatever movement we're trying to achieve, we're trying to get the shoulder to do it all. Whereas, as you touched on with the bench press example, if we bring in other parts of the body, other joints, other muscles, there's actually less stress that has to go through the shoulder, and it's a more functional or more efficient way to achieve these tasks. So if you're trying to throw a ball without your lower body, without your spine, it's not going to go very far. Exactly. It's basically just like almost like a tricep extension. But if you add in your hips, add in some trunk rotation, then that's where much more power comes. And that's how the shoulder likes to move. There are some big clues anatomically to suggest how the shoulder likes to move. And I think number one is the scapula. So the shoulder blade, it's basically a free floating bone. It's only just about attached to the main skeleton through the clavicle. It's basically just hanging there, supported by muscles. And by its shape, we can see that it likes to slide all over the rib cage in lots of different positions. But in the gym, a lot of movements, we're just trying to hold that scapula in place, which means the shoulder isn't able to move into all the positions that it potentially can and potentially wants to move into. So it's kind of like neutral spine. We're
Yeah.
training our body to hold one position, which actually reduces its ability in all the other potential positions. So if we're only ever neutral spine, it means we're not so good at flexion, extension, side bending, and rotating. If we're only ever holding our scapulars depressed and retracted, then the other four motions of the scapula don't get any stimulation. So I think if we try to expand the arsenal of exercises that we use to train the shoulders and get them more in three planes of motion, get them more in conjunction with full body movements, so adding in the side bending, adding in the rotating, adding in the lower body, then a lot of things start to iron themselves out and the shoulders will probably start to feel better.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice way to utilize in your like accessory training or your pre big lift training, doing these positions. And I can say personally, from doing say just the 3D shoulder matrix, how my shoulders prior to bench pressing do feel a lot more switched on. And when we talk about the 3D shoulder matrix, the pressing one, it's basically pressing light dumbbells going forward, backwards, behind me, to the side, and over me, and rotating. So I'm going through all these different planes of motion, so that by the time I get to the bench press, my shoulders have had a 360 warm up essentially, rather than just warming up my benching. So rather than just, and maybe doing some lateral raises and some shoulder presses if you're lucky. So for me, once I started adding in these more triplanar movements, it just opened it up. And one of the ways that I thought about when you was just discussing about throwing a ball is like, imagine trying to throw a ball like a dart. You just
Yeah,
wouldn't, because it just wouldn't go anywhere. Yes, why you do, you use your full body when you're trying to launch that ball as far as possible. It's amazing because when you take it back to your childhood and you're playing in the playground and just remember like launching tennis balls and also it's like
yeah,
you moved in so many planes. And that's why I think there's such a push at the moment to kind of come back to the roots of play and just moving in so many different ways, because it's, and even like, running barefoot, like, I've seen a lot more people talking about running barefoot, sprinting barefoot. Don't just go out and do that off the whim, but warm yourself up into it. But it's these type of like foundational, as you said, like going right back, these type of movement patterns that we need to start reintroducing into our training,
yeah,
rather than just fixating on the gym-based exercise, because the gym-based exercises are fun and
yeah.
they're not changing in my plan anytime soon. But throwing in more other movements that are different just adds some more spice and variety into training, which means that the shoulders, the hips, the knees start to actually get exposure to positions they don't normally get exposure to.
Exactly. And I think, like you touched on the shoulder matrix or the stimulus six shoulder presses, it's basically a systematic way to add in all three planes of motion in both directions. So why is that important? Why does that help the shoulders? If we go back to what we were just saying there, because we're allowing the spine to side bend, we're allowing the spine to flex and extend, we're allowing the spine to rotate left and right, we're sequencing the joints and the muscles to work together as a team. So we're not separating shoulder motion from spine motion. We're actually training them to work together. There's even some lower body movement. Your hips are going to shift forwards, back, left, right, and twist a little bit as well. So we're teaching the body to work together as an overall unit. And we're also lengthening our muscles in more directions, which means that they actually get exposed to more total stretch and more total shortening. So we improve the muscle activation for all those muscles around the shoulder without really having to think about it. Like we just hit those six positions, and baked into that is both of those big benefits. So it's no surprise that you feel better when you're benching, because you've probably taken your shoulder muscles, your pec muscles, your lats through greater ranges of motion than they would normally experience. So they're firing together better than they were before, and you're also sequencing them with other muscles of the body, so you have a more conjoined total body output because the body's talking to each other better. And I think as a real simple, quick, easy win, building that into your shoulder warm ups is it's almost a no brainer.
Yeah, because it's like it doesn't even feel like you're doing. Oh, I'm doing this really silly like silly movements that you're doing it, and you're genuinely feeling the shoulders feeling better. You're feeling the stretch in your ribs, you're feeling the stretch on the T-spine, you're feeling the rotation in your obliques, and like you're feeling everything switching on. So I think what would be quite cool now is maybe if we run through some of like the anatomy basics, because obviously I'm talking about all these movements with that, say, shoulder complex, and how good it makes me feel all over. So maybe let's jump into some anatomy 101.
Sure. Yeah. So, as we touched on earlier, the arm's basically hanging from your collarbone. So, in terms of like
I
the
love the
only
thought
place,
of that, just
yeah,
there, hanging
yeah,
away.
yeah. If you strip back any anatomy textbook and just look at the skeleton, the arm basically hangs from the clavicle, but with the shoulder blade as well. So, it has loads of range potential, and the scapula has loads of movement potential around the rib cage. So, as we touched on earlier, the rib cage doesn't move. The rib cage is attached to the thoracic spine, so it's likely that the thoracic spine doesn't move very well. So one of the common themes we see with restricted shoulders is that someone's thoracic spine doesn't move at all. So if the spine doesn't move at all, or it's very stiff, or it lacks specific motions, that means the rib cage can't move very much, which means the scapula can't move very much, which means the shoulder can't move very much. So it's that chain reaction stemming back to the center of the body. So to get the shoulder moving better, we actually need to get the spine moving better. And that's where that 3D movement really comes into its own, in that we focus so much on thoracic extension in its pure form by like arching our back over a medicine ball or a foam roller, trying to crank on it. But actually, the spine in nature, in natural movements, in gait, likes to move in all three planes at the same time. So combinations of flexion and extension with side bending, with rotation is actually how we loosen up the spine much better. So from an anatomy point of view, if we want shoulders that move better, we need to get the foundation from which the shoulders operate, which is the T-spine and the shoulder girdle. We need to get that moving better to then unlock the ranges that we want to see in the shoulders. And I think that's probably the most common pattern you see, especially with gym-based athletes, because so much of our training, especially with heavy barbell, asks for spinal stiffness.
Yeah.
And spinal stiffness has benefits for bracing when you're doing back squats or deadlifts, but there is a cost to pay for your shoulders, in that that spine that doesn't move so much requires more movement from elsewhere. So it might require more movement from the lower back, or it might require more movement from the shoulder joint itself, which with a scapula that is either stuck or it has to become hypermobile to compensate for the lack of motion through the T spine, is why a lot of these niggles and injuries start to come about. Whereas if the spine was just a little bit more mobile, moved in all three planes better, then actually it brings a lot of reinforcements to the shoulder. Like the major muscles of the upper body can get involved and engaged better. So the smaller muscles like the rotator cuff, the common guilty party or innocent victim, should we say, is gets overworked.
So I'm just when you brought up one of those traditional like T-spine openers, like the wall ball, the foam roller, the cranking over it,
Yeah,
and it just got me thinking because I was like, well, genuinely, I like that feeling. I like
yeah,
lying on it, and it just feels nice to open up the spine. So maybe as a takeaway, maybe you can make it a bit more triplanar dynamic, where you reach over diagonally with one hand over the wall ball, you're reaching over the other way, you're maybe reaching over to the side. So
yeah,
you're using that wall ball to kind of open up the T spine, but you're doing it in a dynamic way where you're reaching in multiple directions to give you that same, say, feeling while you can still do something that you're comfortable doing. Because I think a lot of people do like the wall ball T spine opener, that
yeah,
feeling. So maybe
yeah.
there's a way you can 3D it.
Spot on. Yeah, absolutely, and that would be far more effective. It's something we talk about in the mentorship a lot, that like pure sagittal spinal extension almost never happens outside of the gym. Like in almost all sports, whenever there's spinal extension, there's some degree of side bending or rotating. If you think about, the big throwing sports, you think about golf, tennis, there's always some degree of side bending or rotation when you arch your back and go up to overhead. It's only in the gym that we try to stay purely strict. So that cranking on it in the sagittal plane, anatomically, the back of the vertebrae, there's a little like tooth-like bit sticking out. If they're all lined up, they clash. So actually, the spine doesn't like pure extension without any rotation. If we rotate the spine slightly, those teeth coming off the back of the vertebrae basically stagger into like a spiral staircase like formation. So there's more room for them to extend. So exactly like I said, that's a great tweak to a classic T-spine mobilization, just to be slightly rotated as you arch your back, and you'll probably feel that you can go a little bit further and it's a little less blocked because the spine's in a happier position that it's anatomically predisposed to go into.
Nice. So yeah, that's a little takeaway for you guys. So maybe if you think about, do you know what, I currently do this wall ball option. And if you don't know what we're talking about, you're going to be thinking about getting that mid back on a wall ball and kind of pulling your shoulders backwards over that, and maybe having, say, a plate overhead. That's a traditional, say, T-spine opener. But now what we're saying is maybe adding in a bit more dynamic reach with that, and you're utilizing your hips, either pulling them higher off the floor or lowering them down closer to the floor to adjust that intensity of how much stretch you want through that range of motion.
Spot on. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's the main bits on from an anatomy point of view. Maybe the next useful bit is to think about the major muscles,
Yep.
also anatomical. And I think for shoulders, if we think of the biggest, strongest muscles around the shoulders, as always, we want to make sure they are doing work, because if they're not, there's going to be a huge deficit in terms of stability and control provided to the shoulder. You want your star players performing at their best. And the star player in the upper body is definitely the lat. It's a massive muscle, and people think of it as only a pulling muscle. Lats, as all powerlifters will know, bench pressing have a huge role in controlling and stabilizing the shoulder, in pushing as well. So they need to be doing some work there. So if your lats aren't engaged or firing very well, then you're almost definitely at least leaving some performance on the table, and at worst, giving the rest of your shoulder a much harder time than is necessary. So go through that tick list. Lats, next on the priority list would be pecs, especially pec major is a massive muscle that we want to ensure is engaged for pushes, but also pulls, and especially kipping movements. So when you're going into an arch position, the pec should be controlling that swing on the bar, and that's a very common thing you see in CrossFit. If someone has poor pec recruitment, then that shoulder is going to be lacking a lot of stability and potentially just smashing into end range of the joint without much control. So lats and pecs would be top two. Then the other ones you want to look at are rhomboids, traps, and delts as the bigger muscles of the shoulder. And with only if those five are functioning well, should we really be thinking about the rotator cuff. Rotator cuff can get overworked easily, but the reason it gets overworked is probably because the previous five muscle groups are not doing as much as they should be. So we can treat the rotator cuff and help it to heal, but it's going to continue to get re-injured unless the big main stars of the shoulders are all pulling their weight.
Yeah, and I think if you wanted to try a little tester to kind of see what we mean, is if you kind of get your arms out in front of you and push them forward, you feel your chest essentially disappear. And if you're then trying to press in there and you've got your chest isn't, say, stabilizing that shoulder that much, you can start to understand why, if you're adding a lot of load to this, you can understand why the shoulders are like what I touched on earlier, so you can get there. And same thing kind of when you roll your shoulder fully forward and you try and touch under your armpits, and notice how your lat disappears. So it's like, this is where, if we're trying to think about recruiting these muscles, understanding, scapular elevation, depression, like what part is the best, where the elbows need to be. So whether you're pressing horizontally or vertically or pulling or so forth, it's when you start to understand more than just the movement itself and start to think, okay, well, what muscles am I recruiting in this? What can I feel? Am I
Yeah.
feeling all shoulders? If you are feeling all shoulders, then maybe regress the movement, like using the pull-up as an example. I know there's a lot of people that do pull-ups and they just feel the front of their delts, so the front shoulder just burn out. And it's because the lats are just not working as much. And
Yeah.
then when you regress it maybe to a self-assisted pull-up on a barbell, where you can have your feet on the floor and you're basically doing a lat pull down or a pull-up with the support of your feet, you start to think, okay, I can actually, let me drop the shoulders slightly or maybe slightly internally rotate. You can then start playing around with these positions and find the best position for you to start to get into those muscles and get them working more. And then when you're doing nice global movements, then these muscles will be able to start to utilize things a lot better rather than just relying upon the stabilizers all the time.
Yeah, that's a really nice point. I think exercise selection is quite individual depending on people's experience and capacity in those muscles. So if you start to push beyond the capacity, say, of your lats or your skill in the lats, and you start to get fatigued, that's when those compensation patterns can creep in. So if you're an athlete, having the awareness to feel when the right muscles are not doing the work, and if you're a coach or a PT, I think you the thing about touching the muscle is a really useful thing for coaches and PTs, and a lot of bodybuilding coaches are really good at this, where they help the client or athlete feel that muscle engage by giving it a little prod. Basically, so you give them a little prod in the lats, and you can either feel whether it tenses, whether the tone increases through that muscle. You know it's working through the movement, and bringing a little bit of awareness to it from a bodybuilding point of view is really, really great. So as you're going through that checklist of are the big boys doing the big work in the shoulders, having a prod can be really helpful.
Massively. So, what are maybe some general good shoulder practices that people should be thinking about? We've touched on quite a few points throughout today's episode, so it'd be nice to maybe kind of round it up into some takeaways that the listeners can get cracking on with now to get some bulletproof shoulders.
Sure. So I think number one is to move the shoulders in conjunction with the spine. So as we touched on earlier, if you're pressing in any direction, allowing the spine to come with the shoulders is actually great. As long as the load is appropriate, there's almost no wrong movements. If you think about all the crazy positions the spine and shoulder can get into in sports, they are legitimate positions that if we give safe exposure to, we actually build robustness in the body. So we don't want to just avoid movements. We want to condition them to handle more. So adding the spine and potentially even the hips into your shoulder movements and warm-ups. That means twists, side bends, the old school short shoulder warm-ups like air swimming, where you're,
Or the
doing
arm
front crawl.
swings, the arm swings as well. They are.
Yeah,
I love
exactly.
it.
They're brilliant. And
Yeah.
baked into like a standing front crawl or backstroke, you're getting loads of T-spine motion
Yeah.
as well. So I do that basically every session before I'm doing something upper body. And it's just so quick and easy to hit lots of different positions and ranges.
I find holding on to like a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball something while you're doing it is a really nice way to kind of get that motion as well. Right? Obviously with a nice open hand, but sometimes I like to hold on to something, just not so incredibly light, but it just starts to feel a little bit nicer for me. But
definitely, it gives it a bit of momentum as well.
Yeah.
So it's going to drive you into slightly bigger ranges of motion. So yeah, something light or even like a 1 kilo plates is a good thing to do there. As always, 3D exposure. So these don't just have to be warm-ups. These can be training movements as well. So the press matrix that we talked about, you can, like Rob said, you can use it as a light warm-up, but you can also select specific components of that. You can do all 6, or you can do the ones that you struggle with and use them as accessory exercises to load and to progress as well. If you've got phenomenally strong press in all 3 planes, you're probably going to have a phenomenally strong press in the sagittal plane. Like the carryover is significant.
Yeah,
so don't underestimate the power there.
No, I've been loading up the lateral one, so pressing over my head sideways, so keeping in that frontal plane, and that's where I've been really noticing. I've been getting a real good like shoulder, T-spine, like everything's just been really, really nice in that movement, and more just for like say shoulder health, it's been feeling better. So I have been kind of slowly, progressively overloading that, but I'm really not trying to my dumbbells go 5, 10, 15. So, I'm spending a little bit of time at certain loads. So,
Yeah,
but it's,
you
it's
can get up
really
to
good.
15, mate.
Oh, mate, no, I am at 15. That's
Yeah,
what I'm saying. But
yeah,
after that, it's 22 and a half. So,
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
mean,
That's
all right,
that's a
mate.
big jump.
Challenge
Yeah,
accepted.
yeah. Um, and from the pulling side of things, we've got ring row variations. So the lateral ring row, when you're standing sideways to a single ring, so it'll be one arm at a time. So you're getting a side bend, pulling that elbow towards the hip. It's great for lats. Like a lot of people who can't feel their lats in other pulls will be able to get their lats involved in that pull pattern. And equally, we can do the opposite, something we call the ring overhead side glide, which is kind of the opposite of what Rob was talking about with the lateral
Yeah.
press to overheads. One hand is overhead and you're getting a big stretch through the lats and obliques, and you pull yourself back up to standing. These are on the Training Stimulus YouTube channel if you want to see what they look like. And the other thing I think is really useful for shoulder health is straight arm work as well as bent arm work. So gymnasts are really good at this in that they separate the two, and we don't do too much of it in the sort of traditional gym environment where it's always focused on pushing and pulling, whereas doing stuff with the elbow locked out forces the shoulder to do a little bit more work, create a little bit more stability. So stuff like planks, single arm planks, straight arm hanging, even kipping, you could class as straight arm work if you don't bend your elbows. Things like Turkish get ups as well. Great classic exercise for shoulder health because the shoulder is forced to do the stabilizing if the elbow remains locked out. And it's really important the elbow does
Yeah.
remain locked out because that's a common compensation pattern if somebody isn't so good at controlling the shoulder.
Yeah, same as like handstands, like getting into that head through position, like again, keeping that arm locked out. I mean, when it does come to all of these movements, also don't be afraid to take them through their full ranges of motion. So as I've mentioned a few times today about that protraction. So thinking about those shoulders going as far forward as they can, and thinking about going as far back as they can, elevation and depression. So going through that full range under control and with load, you can start to really take your training to the next level, because rather than always having that depressed, locked in state, we're then having the ability that when things do need to go outside of there and your shoulders do need to protract a bit, they've had exposure there, they've had strength there. Just like we mentioned in previous episodes with like the spine and stuff like that, we need exposure to these positions to really help us get the full potential that we can out of our training.
Yeah, spot on. So yeah, I think those are probably the main things. In summary, it's basically move your spine more and differently. Make sure you expose your shoulders to all three planes of motion, and giving extra movement downstream will actually give you more movement upstream. So if you get your hips and spine doing a bit more, then the shoulders can actually be a little bit freer and happier. One thing that we didn't actually talk about as much as we maybe should is that your overhead position is a combination of thoracic spine extension and shoulder flexion. So both of those need to be working for you to get into a good fully overhead position. So make sure you check your spine as well as your shoulders. Don't just crank on the shoulder stretches. If your spine's super stiff, then that's going to be limiting how far you can get those hands overhead. And yeah, as we just talked about, exposing your shoulders to more than just the classic horizontal and vertical push and pull will mean that those classic movements will actually benefit more. You'll probably experience performance boosts and improve shoulder health.
Beautiful, mate. So we hope you take away as much from today's episode as I did as well. For me, I cannot say any more how good adding 3D movements, 3D shoulder movements, well, in general, across the full body, really, it's upgraded so much my training. But beyond just necessarily just lifting more load, but just how healthy I have felt through my big main lifts. And that has been one of the main things, because of lifting a fair amount of load through my squat, my deadlift and my bench press. It's having health in these joints it's so important for them being able to keep coming back to the gym and hitting the loads that I'm looking to hit. So definitely take this away from you. And if you got any more questions about some of these shoulder practices or anything like that, do drop us a message on Instagram or on the website, and we'll be sure to get back to you and hopefully give you some help. And maybe we'll throw it into a Q&A episode, which will hopefully be coming up sometime soon. So do throw your questions our way. So if you did enjoy today's episode, we would love for you to share it on social media. Don't forget to tag us at lunge.lift. And if you did, you could also leave us a cheeky review. Head over to YouTube, subscribe to our channel and all the good stuff. So thank you as always. We really appreciate our growing audience. And we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, guys.